Nikon Z8 versus Nikon Z6. So you may remember in a previous video that I made that I talked a little bit about the noise performance between the Nikon Z6 and the Nikon Z8. And I've been doing some more investigations into the sensors of these two cameras. And this is just for fun. I don't really think that what I'm doing or what I'm measuring makes too much of a real difference in photography. Here's a photo from the Z6, and here's a photo from the Z8. I find them both very capable cameras. Obviously, the Z8 has many advantages over the Z6, like its autofocus. But just purely in terms of sensor capabilities, I was wondering, how different are these two sensors at high ISOs? Now, in the previous video, you may remember that the unedited files had an approximate difference of about 0.6 stops, or about 3/5 of a stop. But then there were two caveats to that. The caveat number one is that the Nikon Z6 has an anti-aliasing filter, so the noise looks a little bit more smoothed out, and it's a little less sharp. The files from the Z6 are a little less sharp than the files from the Z8. In other words, if you take the same lens and you put it on the Z6, and you take a photo with it, and then you put it on the Z8 and do the same thing, and downsize the Z8 photo to the size of the Z6, which is 24 megapixels, you're going to get a file that's sharper. The photo will look sharper than the photo taken on the Z6. So if you then take that into account, and you also take into account that there's a little bit more information in the Z8 file, and then you kind of equalize those differences, and you can check my other video out for that. The difference between the Z6 and the Z8, just in terms of information retention, is something more like 0.2 stops, at least when you're just considering the appearance of noise over detail. But there's another side to this story, and I didn't really mention that in my past video, and that's chrominance noise. How does the Nikon Z6 distort colors at high ISOs compared to the Nikon Z8? So what I did was I compared now the chrominance noise. Now, the way I did that was I took a picture of a color checker and I compared the variance in noise patterns, both in chrominance and luminance. So I compared the noise variation in the green, blue, and red squares of the color checker. And I got some results. So let's take a look first at the luminance noise now. If you look at the luminance noise here, you'll see that there isn't too much of a difference between the Z6 and the Z8. You can see that the greens in the green square, the luminance variation is very similar. It's interesting that in the red square, actually, the Nikon Z6 scored a higher variance than the Nikon Z8. I think that's because somehow the representation of reds in the two cameras is a little different. It seemed like even after equalizing for luminance with identical exposures, the Z6 file was slightly brighter than the Z8 in terms of the reds. I'm not sure why that was happening at high ISOs. But anyway, I'll have to investigate that a little more carefully later. But let's go back to the Nikon Z6 versus Z8 luminance chart. And you'll see that, yeah, the blues also, the Z8 scored a little bit worse. I would say that the Z6 versus Z8 luminance variation isn't too great. Actually, the more interesting story is the chrominance variation. So let's take a look at the chrominance variation. And this is basically the variation in chroma calculated on hue values as angles when converted into unit vectors in Cartesian space. We can see immediately some differences between the Z6 and the Z8. So the Nikon Z6 in all color patches, red, blue, and green, score better than the Nikon Z8. You can see that the greens are very different, the reds are also very different, and the blues are different. The biggest difference maybe between the greens. That's kind of interesting too. I always thought that greens looked pretty bad in noise, and maybe this is the reason. But anyway, that also needs a little bit more investigating. I have to see exactly what's causing that. But basically, you can see that in this graph, the Nikon Z8 scores significantly worse in chroma variation. And I'll put up, for example, the two green patches you can see on the left is a Nikon Z6, and on the right is the Nikon Z8. The chrominance is indeed more varied in the Nikon Z8 files than the Nikon Z6. Now, keep in mind that these tests are run on downsized files. So the Nikon Z8 file downsized to Nikon Z6 resolution. So pretty much, theoretically, they should be identical, but because the sensors are different resolutions, one is stacked. The Z8 has a stacked sensor. The Z6 has a backside illuminated sensor, so there are going to be some differences. And it turns out this is a difference here. So in my first video, just in terms of detail retention, I did sort of point out that there's a fairly minimal difference between the Z6 and the Z8. But this is another part of the story. It shows that the Nikon Z6 has better chroma performance at high ISO. What that means is you're going to get better color with the Nikon Z6 at very high ISO compared to the Nikon Z8. Now, if you have a large patch of color, that might not make a difference because maybe denoising will be enough to equalize the two, like I talked about in my previous video. But if you have just a thin strand of color or a small amount of color and very subtle color in certain areas, maybe multicolored objects, patterned objects, it does show that if there's too much color variation in the Nikon Z8 files, you may not be able to get them looking as good as the files from the Nikon Z6. So I think looking back at this investigation, what we can say is as follows. Just in terms of pure detail, I think the Z6 and the Z8 are pretty good, roughly equal at retaining detail at high ISO with a small advantage to the Z6. But where the Z6 pulls ahead more is actually in terms of color retention. So if you're very concerned about color reproduction at higher ISOs, the Z6 still is a bit of a better camera in this case. Now, even then, I think that the differences between these two cameras is very small. I mean, the differences mainly show past ISO 6400. The biggest differences, of course, are ISO 25600, which is the max native ISO of the Nikon Z8. So photographically, I think it's not really going to make too much of a difference. If you're at ISO 25600, then I think that the file's already pretty unusable and you're probably doing something wrong photographically. But that's still something to keep in mind. Every little bit helps, like I often like to say. So for high ISO color reproduction, cameras like the Z6 are just a little bit better. So that could be something to keep in mind if you're really looking for high ISO performance. Maybe one of the 24 megapixel cameras might be a little better. I would like to test the Nikon Z6 III. I don't have a Nikon Z6 III. I would like to test some of the other Nikon cameras. I only have a Z6 and a Z8 to test. So that's all I can show you for now. But I hope this video helped you understand a little bit more about the noise performance differences between the Z6 and the Z8. And I'll see you again next time.